In 2026, we have high-speed internet, digital wallets, and AI for almost everything. Yet, a single trip to the grocery store feels like a financial crisis. Why? Why is it that with all this incredible technology, we're more stressed about money than ever before? To find the answer, we have to travel back exactly 90 years to a time known as the Great Depression, a time when banks failed, jobs disappeared, and entire communities watched their world go dark. But here's the secret. The people who lived through that nightmare left behind something far more valuable than money. Our ancestors didn't just survive, they mastered a set of skills that made them almost inflation-proof. Skills that, in our modern comfort, we've almost completely forgotten. But in 2026, these aren't just old-fashioned habits anymore. They're quietly becoming essential survival skills. In this video, I'll show you how modern families are secretly using 1930s survival strategies to cut their monthly bills nearly in half, escape the debt trap, and finally find peace in today's chaotic economy. And stay with me until skill number 4, because it's the one forgotten habit modern banks would rather you never rediscover. So, if you're ready to spend less, stress less, and learn the forgotten wisdom that once saved millions, let's travel back to the 1930s to save your 2026. Susan stood in her kitchen holding a bag of vegetable peels she was about to throw away. Something stopped her hand mid-air. She remembered her grandmother's voice, saying that nothing in a Depression-era kitchen was ever truly garbage. Onion skins, carrot tops, celery ends, they all had a second life waiting for them. Back in the 1930s, families didn't view scraps as waste. They viewed them as unclaimed value. A pot of water, some bones, and yesterday's vegetable trimmings could become a broth rich enough to carry an entire week of meals. Stale bread wasn't thrown out either. It became bread pudding, savory stuffing, or thickening for soup. Meat was treated like gold. 500 grams of ground beef, stretched with oats, beans, or breadcrumbs, could feed a family of 6 without anyone noticing the difference. Susan tried it herself one Sunday, turning a single small roast into 3 separate meals. Her grocery bill that month dropped by nearly 40%. Her husband asked what changed, and she simply smiled and said, "I stopped throwing away money." The scraps that once went into the trash now simmered quietly on the back burner, transforming into something her family looked forward to. It wasn't deprivation, it was extraction. Every ounce of value pulled from ingredients most people considered done. Her kids, at first skeptical of scrap soup, started asking for it by name within a month. Susan began keeping a small container in the freezer just for peels and ends, filling it a little more each week without even thinking about it. By the time it was full, she had the base for an entire pot of broth waiting, no extra shopping trip required. She noticed something else, too. Her kitchen felt calmer, less wasteful, more intentional. And that was only the beginning of what Margaret's generation understood that we forgot. Linda noticed a small tear in her daughter's favorite sweater and instinctively reached for the trash bag. Then she paused. In the 1930s, clothing wasn't disposable. It was an investment meant to last generations. Women learned invisible mending, a needle technique so precise that a repaired sweater looked untouched. Old bed sheets weren't discarded either. They became children's clothing, aprons, or patchwork quilts passed down for decades. Families learned to recognize quality fabric, thick cotton, tightly woven wool, stitching that held under stress, instead of falling for cheap, thin material designed to fall apart within a single season. Linda picked up a needle for the first time in years and mended that small tear herself. It took 12 minutes. The sweater looked brand new. She thought about how much money she'd spent replacing worn-out clothes that were only worn out because they were built to be replaced. Fast fashion promised convenience, but delivered a cycle of constant spending. The 1930s wardrobe promised durability, and durability meant freedom from that cycle. Linda began teaching her daughter the same stitch her own grandmother once used, a tradition nearly lost, revived in one quiet evening. Her daughter, thrilled to see her favorite sweater saved instead of thrown away, asked to learn the stitch herself the very next weekend. Linda started keeping a small mending basket by the couch, patching small tears the moment she noticed them instead of letting damage grow worse. She began inspecting new purchases differently too, checking seams, checking fabric weight, asking herself if an item was built to last or built to be replaced. And she realized something unexpected. The clothes weren't just lasting longer. Her family was spending significantly less every single year. Patricia's neighbor, Deborah, once fixed a leaking faucet in exchange for a basket of homegrown tomatoes. No cash exchanged hands, no invoice was written, just trust and a handshake. This wasn't unusual in the 1930s. When cash was scarce, skills became currency. A woman who could sew traded her talent for someone else's fresh eggs. A man who could repair engines traded labor for firewood. Entire neighborhoods functioned on invisible economies built from mutual reliability rather than dollar bills. Patricia began wondering if modern neighborhoods had lost something valuable in trading community for convenience. She started small, offering to watch a neighbor's children in exchange for garden vegetables. Within weeks, an unspoken network began to form. Nobody called it a barter system, they just called it helping each other out. But underneath that simple phrase was a powerful financial strategy, one that reduced spending without reducing quality of life. In a world of rising prices and stretched paychecks, Patricia realized that trust between neighbors could function as a hidden financial safety net, something no bank account could replicate. It wasn't about avoiding money entirely. It was about remembering that value could exist outside of it, too. Soon, another neighbor offered to teach piano lessons in exchange for weekly bread baking, and a third began trading spare produce for babysitting on weekend evenings. Nobody wrote a single receipt, nobody kept a formal record. The only currency that mattered was follow-through, showing up when you said you would. Patricia found herself relying less on her credit card and more on the people living just a few doors away, a shift that felt both old-fashioned and strangely modern at the same time. Jennifer stared at her heating bill and felt her stomach tighten. Then she remembered something her grandfather used to say, "Heat the person, not the room." In the 1930s, families didn't waste fuel warming empty air. They focused on keeping bodies warm directly. Heavy curtains blocked drafts before they ever entered a home. Warm stones, heated near the stove and wrapped in cloth, kept beds warm through freezing nights, a method some called the hot stone trick. Cooking wasn't just about dinner either. Families timed their meals to use residual stove heat for baking or warming rooms nearby, stretching every ounce of energy twice. Jennifer tried the curtain trick first, hanging thick fabric over her drafty windows. The difference was immediate. Her living room felt warmer without the furnace running as often. She started batch cooking on weekends, using the oven's leftover warmth to heat her kitchen during the coldest hours of the evening. Her energy bill, usually alarming in January, came in noticeably lower. No smart thermostat, no expensive renovation, just old instincts about how heat actually moves through a home. It made her wonder how many modern solutions were simply expensive replacements for wisdom our grandparents already had for free. She started closing doors to unused rooms, trapping warmth in the spaces her family actually occupied instead of heating the entire house evenly. She layered wool socks and a soft throw blanket over her lap while reading at night, instead of nudging the thermostat higher. Small habits, almost too simple to mention, yet together they added up to real, visible savings on paper. Her husband, initially doubtful, became the one reminding her to check the curtains each evening as the temperature dropped outside. Barbara lived in a small apartment with no yard, yet she grew more vegetables than some of her friends with full backyards. Her secret came from a forgotten wartime habit called the victory garden, adapted for windowsills instead of fields. Onion bottoms regrown in a cup of water. Celery ends sprouting new stalks on a sunny sill. Herbs thriving in small pots that took up almost no space. This wasn't decoration, it was food security disguised as gardening. In the 1930s, families without land still found ways to grow high-calorie, high-yield vegetables in whatever space they had. Barbara started with a single pot of scallions regrown from kitchen scraps. Within 2 weeks, she had fresh green onions without spending another cent at the store. She added celery next, then herbs, until her windowsill quietly became a small, ongoing harvest. When grocery prices spiked unexpectedly that spring, Barbara barely noticed. Her family still had fresh vegetables on the table. It wasn't about replacing grocery shopping entirely. It was about creating a buffer, a small layer of protection against supply shocks and price surges that once caught her completely off guard. Encouraged, Barbara added a small pot of lettuce that regrew after each harvest, snipping leaves as needed rather than buying an entire head at once. Her windowsill slowly turned into a rotating little ecosystem, something new sprouting almost every week. Friends who visited started asking how she managed fresh herbs in such a tiny apartment, and she simply pointed to the sill, smiling as if she'd rediscovered a secret hiding in plain sight the whole time. Nancy caught herself reaching for her phone to order something she didn't need again. Then she remembered a rule from her grandmother's era, one so simple it seemed almost impossible. Wait 30 days before buying anything non-essential. In the 1930s, credit wasn't viewed as a convenient tool. It was viewed as a dangerous trap that could quietly destroy a family's stability. People saved first and purchased second, a complete reversal of today's buy now, pay later culture. Nancy decided to test the 30-day rule on a jacket she'd added to her online cart 3 times that week. She closed the tab and waited. 10 days later, she barely remembered wanting it. 20 days later, the urge had disappeared entirely. By day 30, she realized the impulse wasn't really about the jacket. It was about a dopamine spike triggered by scrolling and clicking. Breaking that loop didn't just save her money, it lowered her stress. She wasn't juggling regret over impulsive purchases anymore. She felt more in control of her own decisions than she had in years. What seemed like an old-fashioned inconvenience turned out to be a powerful psychological reset, protecting both her wallet and her peace of mind. She started applying the same rule to bigger purchases, furniture, electronics, even a vacation she'd been eyeing impulsively for weeks. Each time, the waiting period revealed the same pattern. Most of the urgency faded once the initial excitement wore off. Nancy began to see credit differently too, less like a convenient bridge and more like a quiet debt her grandmother would have warned her about immediately. Her bank balance at the end of the month finally told a story she felt proud of. Michelle used to spend nearly $30 a month on cleaning products alone, until she opened an old recipe book that belonged to her aunt. Inside were more than a dozen household solutions made from little more than vinegar, baking soda, and rendered fat. In the 1930s, families couldn't afford brand-name products, so they created their own from pantry basics. Vinegar cut through grease and disinfected countertops. Baking soda scrubbed pots, deodorized refrigerators, and softened laundry. Herbal remedies passed down through generations treated minor everyday ailments long before pharmacies were part of daily life. Michelle mixed her first batch of all-purpose cleaner using vinegar and water. It worked just as well as her expensive store-bought spray, without the overwhelming chemical smell lingering in her kitchen. She moved on to a baking soda scrub for her sink, then a simple herbal salve for dry skin, something her aunt swore by decades earlier. Her cabinet, once crowded with brightly labeled bottles, became simple and organized. Her spending on cleaning supplies dropped dramatically. More than that, she felt reassured knowing exactly what ingredients touched her family's home without unpronounceable chemicals hidden in fine print. She started labeling small jars in her pantry, vinegar solution, baking soda scrub, herbal salve, until her aunt's old recipe book had a permanent home right on her counter. Neighbors began asking for copies of her homemade cleaner recipe after noticing how fresh her kitchen smelled without a single artificial scent. What began as a way to cut costs slowly became something Michelle took genuine pride in, a small return to self-sufficiency in a home filled with store-bought convenience for years. Karen and her husband once believed that a smaller household meant more privacy and less stress. Then her mother moved in after retirement, and everything about their finances shifted. In the 1930s, multiple generations living under one roof wasn't unusual. It was the foundation of financial stability. Shared housing meant shared costs, and grandparents provided childcare that no nursery could ever replace, both financially and emotionally. Karen's mother began watching the grandchildren twice a week, saving the family hundreds of dollars a month in childcare costs. In return, Karen and her husband covered a larger share of the mortgage, easing her mother's fixed retirement income. What started as a practical arrangement slowly became something deeper. Dinners felt fuller. Holidays felt warmer. The loneliness her mother had quietly struggled with after retirement began to fade, replaced by daily connection with her grandchildren. It wasn't just a financial solution to a housing crisis that felt increasingly out of reach for so many families. It was a return to something the modern world had slowly stripped away. Generations supporting each other, not just financially, but emotionally too. Karen noticed her own stress easing too, no longer scrambling to coordinate last-minute childcare or juggling a nursery's rigid pickup schedule. Her mother, once quiet and withdrawn after retiring, seemed to light up around the children in a way Karen hadn't seen in years. Friends who once questioned the arrangement slowly began asking questions of their own, wondering if their own aging parents might welcome the same kind of shared, connected household. Sarah watched her water bill climb for the third month in a row and finally remembered something her grandmother once mentioned about the Dust Bowl years. Water wasn't wasted, ever, because water was survival. Families reused bath water to clean floors. Rinse water from vegetables watered garden beds. A bucket system caught water while it warmed up in the shower, later used for houseplants and her small vegetable garden outside. It felt strange at first, almost too simple to matter, but her next water bill told a different story, noticeably lower than the months before. She wasn't sacrificing comfort, she was simply refusing to let water disappear down the drain without extracting its full value first. In a decade of increasing water restrictions and climate uncertainty, that old Dust Bowl habit suddenly felt less like nostalgia and more like quiet preparation. Sarah began saving pasta water, too, once discarded down the sink, now poured directly onto her garden beds, where the starch seemed to help her tomatoes thrive. She taught her children to turn off the tap while brushing their teeth, a small habit that felt almost invisible but added up steadily over months. Her family began treating water less like an endless utility and more like the finite resource it had always been, something previous generations never had the luxury of forgetting. Mary sat one evening scrolling through 4 different streaming apps, unable to find anything worth watching, yet still paying for all 4 every single month. She thought back to something her grandfather described from his childhood: evenings filled with library books, front porch storytelling, and outdoor games that cost absolutely nothing. In the 1930s, entertainment wasn't purchased, it was created. Families gathered around simple activities, card games, community storytelling, walks that doubled as conversation. Mary canceled 2 of her 4 subscriptions and visited her local library for the first time in years. She left with an armful of books and a strange, unexpected excitement. That weekend, she gathered her children for an old-fashioned game night instead of separate screens in separate rooms. The laughter felt different, more present somehow. Her monthly subscription costs dropped, but something else changed too. Time itself felt less rushed, less scattered across a dozen digital distractions. She realized entertainment didn't require a monthly payment. It required presence, connection, and a willingness to slow down, exactly what families had relied on nearly a century earlier, long before endless scrolling replaced it. Mary started a small weekly tradition, one evening completely free of screens, just books, board games, and conversation around the kitchen table. Her children complained at first, then slowly began looking forward to it, asking on Wednesdays if it was library game night yet. The library itself became a quiet weekend ritual, a free outing that somehow felt richer than any paid activity they'd tried before. But here's what Margaret's granddaughter discovered on the very last page of that hidden ledger, the detail that ties every single one of these habits together. It wasn't the broths, the mending, the barter, or the windsill gardens individually that built real financial security. It was the discipline of never letting a single resource, whether food, fabric, water, time, or money, go unaccounted for. Every entry in that ledger represented a decision to notice value where others saw waste. Margaret wasn't poor because she lacked money. She was secure because she refused to let anything slip through her fingers unnoticed. That single mindset, multiplied across a decade of small choices, built a financial foundation strong enough to survive the hardest years in American history. Her granddaughter closed the ledger, looked at her own kitchen, her own family, her own habits, and understood exactly what needed to change. She thought about her own pantry, half-stocked with things she'd forgotten she even owned, her own closet, full of clothes worn once and abandoned, her own subscriptions, quietly draining money every single month without a second thought. None of it was reckless spending in the dramatic sense. It was simply inattention, the same quiet inattention Margaret had spent a lifetime refusing to allow into her own home. That single realization felt heavier than any single line in the ledger itself, because it meant the solution had been available all along, waiting patiently to be noticed again. These 10 forgotten habits were never about deprivation. They were about awareness, about noticing the quiet leaks in daily life that modern convenience has trained us to ignore. Margaret's generation didn't have more money than we do today. They simply refused to waste what they had. And in a world of rising prices, subscription fatigue, and constant consumer pressure, that old ledger might hold more wisdom than any modern budgeting app ever could. Susan, Linda, Patricia, Jennifer, Barbara, Nancy, Michelle, Karen, Sarah, and Mary all found their own version of the same lesson, tucked inside kitchens, closets, gardens, and quiet evenings at home. None of them became wealthy overnight. None of them followed a dramatic get-rich scheme. They simply stopped letting small things slip away unnoticed, and over time, that discipline became its own kind of security, one built slowly, one habit at a time, exactly the way it was built 90 years ago. Do you think families today would save more if they returned to using cash and noticing every dollar the way our grandparents once did? If this story resonated with you, we'd love to hear which habit you're trying first in the comments below. Subscribe if forgotten wisdom like this speaks to you. Share this with someone who needs a little hope this month, and we'll see you in the next story, because the past still has so much left to teach us.